Have you ever felt like there's an invisible wall between you and God, blocking the very blessings you've been desperately praying for? Perhaps you've spent years reaching outward, sending prayers into what feels like an empty void, wondering why divine energy seems to flow freely into others' lives, but somehow bypasses yours completely. What if I told you that the greatest spiritual misunderstanding of our time isn't about what you're doing wrong, but about where you've been looking? This fundamental misconception has kept countless sincere spiritual seekers trapped in a cycle of frustration, constantly straining to connect with a divine presence they believe exists somewhere out there beyond their reach. Has this ever happened to you? You face a crisis, perhaps a health scare, relationship breakdown, or financial emergency, and immediately begin praying intensely, begging for divine intervention, yet feeling that heavenly assistance remains frustratingly unavailable. You're not alone. This experience is nearly universal because we've been taught to look in the wrong direction entirely. The revolutionary understanding I'm about to share with you today doesn't just transform your prayer practice. It completely reimagines your relationship with divine energy and how it flows through every aspect of your daily life. The divine flow you've been seeking isn't blocked by some cosmic gatekeeper requiring the perfect passwords or rituals. It's blocked by a single misperception about where God actually is. But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what you're about to discover might fundamentally change your entire relationship with spiritual practice. When you truly grasp that divine presence isn't something external you need to strain toward, but rather the very essence of your being waiting to be recognized, everything changes. Prayer transforms from desperate pleading to joyful acknowledgement of what already exists within you. Imagine approaching each day not as a separate entity struggling through life alone, but as a living channel through which divine energy naturally flows. Picture facing challenges not with fear and anxiety, but with an unshakable awareness that you can remove the internal blockages preventing divine intelligence from solving problems through you. This isn't positive thinking or wishful spirituality. It's practical mysticism that produces tangible transformation in your health, relationships, finances, and inner peace. The 5 steps I'll be sharing today have changed countless lives worldwide, not through magical formulas, but through a profound shift in spiritual understanding. What would your life look like if you stopped trying to convince an external deity to send blessings your way, and instead focused on removing the internal barriers that have been blocking the divine flow that has always existed within you, perfect and complete? If these teachings on removing blocks to divine flow resonated with you, subscribe to join our community of spiritual seekers who are practicing this recognition in their daily lives. Each new video explores practical ways to experience the divine presence within. In these moments when divine energy seems most distant, the transformative journey begins with what Joel Goldsmith called the practice of the presence. A deceptively simple exercise that creates profound ripples throughout your consciousness. This isn't some complex meditation technique requiring hours of silence in perfect lotus position. It begins with a moment of recognition when you first wake up each morning, before your feet even touch the floor, before your mind becomes entangled in the day's demands. Pause for just a moment and silently acknowledge, the kingdom of heaven is within me right now. This divine flow is my true nature. This tiny decision creates a foundation that shapes how you'll respond to everything the day brings. The hidden revelation most spiritual seekers miss completely is that consistency matters far more than intensity. A brief moment of recognition practiced regularly throughout your day has infinitely more impact than occasional hours of desperate spiritual effort. It's the difference between watering a plant daily with a small cup versus drowning it once a month with a flood. Throughout your day, especially during moments of stress or challenge, take even 30 seconds to return to this inner kingdom. When your boss criticizes your work, when traffic makes you late, when unexpected bills arrive, these are precisely the moments when the practice reveals its transformative power. Instead of reacting immediately from fear or frustration, pause and recognize the truth that exists beyond external appearances. You'll begin noticing subtle shifts at first, a deeper peace in formerly stressful situations, unexpected solutions to persistent problems, a growing sense of guidance in daily decisions. These are signs that you're beginning to remove the internal barriers blocking divine flow. The transformations unfold gradually, but their cumulative impact completely reimagines your life experience. Now, I want to go even deeper into how this understanding applies to specific challenges we all face. Consider health issues, an area where fear can instantly overwhelm our spiritual awareness. When physical symptoms appear, our conditioned response is immediate panic, followed by exclusively seeking material solutions. The breakthrough insight isn't about rejecting medical wisdom or practical care. The journey I'm describing integrates both spiritual understanding and appropriate action. When facing health challenges, first turn within to recognize the spiritual truth. In the kingdom of heaven within you, there is only wholeness, only divine perfection. This recognition doesn't replace medical care, but opens a channel for healing power that transcends material limitations. From this place of spiritual awareness, you can then make decisions about treatment with clarity rather than fear. Think about someone diagnosed with a chronic condition who's been told they'll simply have to manage symptoms indefinitely. From material consciousness alone, this prognosis feels like a prison sentence. But from kingdom consciousness, they recognize that physical appearance isn't the final reality. Their spiritual essence remains whole, regardless of bodily conditions. This recognition creates space for healing that might otherwise be blocked by fear and resignation. You don't ignore symptoms or avoid doctors. You simply bring a different consciousness to the situation. You address physical needs while maintaining awareness of spiritual wholeness. If you've experienced even momentary glimpses where you sense there's more to reality than what appears on the physical surface, write in the comments, "I recognize the wholeness within." This understanding extends far beyond personal healing. The same profound shift in consciousness transforms our relationship with money and material supply. When confronting financial challenges, most people immediately focus on external actions, working harder, cutting expenses, or frantically searching for new income sources. While practical steps matter, the mindset behind those actions determines their effectiveness. The breakthrough insight is returning to the consciousness of the inner kingdom, where divine supply is infinite and eternally flowing. Let me share something from behind the scenes of financial transformation. A businessman I worked with faced complete financial ruin after his partner embezzled company funds. Creditors were demanding payment, legal troubles multiplied daily, and bankruptcy seemed inevitable. Rather than focusing solely on these external circumstances, he began practicing kingdom consciousness each morning and throughout his day. At first, nothing external changed. Bills still arrived, creditors still called, but something shifted internally. The paralyzing fear that had blocked creative solutions began dissolving. From this awareness, right action emerged naturally. He found himself making different decisions, having conversations he would have avoided before, exploring options that fear would have previously ruled out. Within weeks, opportunities appeared that he couldn't have engineered through external manipulation. A former client offered a substantial new contract. An unexpected settlement came through. A strategic partnership materialized. These weren't random coincidences, but consciousness demonstrating its own abundance. The pathway to complete financial recovery opened up not through force or struggle, but through spiritual recognition. This journey of transformation requires something many modern seekers resist: patience. In our world of instant results, we expect immediate spiritual breakthroughs. The hidden truth is that this transformation develops gradually over weeks and months of practice. You won't master this understanding overnight, and that's perfectly natural. Joel Goldsmith himself spent years developing this consciousness through meditation, study, and practical application. What matters is that you begin today with whatever level of understanding you currently possess. The consistency of your practice matters far more than its initial perfection. Some days you'll maintain kingdom consciousness beautifully. Other days you'll forget completely and spend hours in anxiety before remembering the kingdom within. This inconsistency isn't evidence of failure, but the normal rhythm of spiritual development. Consider how a child learns to walk. There are many falls for each successful step at first, yet with persistence, walking eventually becomes effortless. The same principle applies to spiritual awareness. Each time you return to kingdom consciousness after forgetting, you're strengthening that awareness. The path isn't linear. It includes plateaus and even apparent setbacks. But the overall trajectory moves toward increasing spiritual recognition. The profound impact comes in recognizing that you aren't creating this kingdom through positive thinking or willpower. You're simply recognizing what has always existed within you, waiting for your awareness. This revelation transforms spiritual practice from effortful self-improvement to joyful discovery of your true nature. If you've ever experienced the frustration of spiritual growth seeming too slow or inconsistent, write in the comments, "I'm embracing divine timing." The beauty of this practice becomes even more evident when we learn to recognize the subtle transformations that signal our growing awareness. While our mindset often looks for dramatic breakthroughs or miraculous interventions, the true revelations come in quieter moments. As you practice returning to kingdom consciousness, notice the subtle shifts occurring within your daily experience. First, a deeper peace in situations that would have previously triggered stress or anxiety. Then, unexpected solutions appearing for persistent problems that seemed unsolvable from purely material thinking. And perhaps most profound, a growing sense of divine guidance in daily decisions. These might seem like small changes, but they represent a fundamental shift in your inner landscape. You're beginning to live from kingdom consciousness rather than purely from material awareness. It's like learning to see with entirely new eyes. The world hasn't changed, but your perception of it has transformed completely. Where you once saw only problems, you now recognize opportunities. Where you once felt separation from good, you now experience divine presence. A woman in our community described this shift beautifully. After practicing kingdom consciousness for several months, she realized one day that her constant anxiety about the future had been replaced by a quiet confidence. Not because her external circumstances were more secure, they weren't, but because her awareness of the inner kingdom had become more consistent. This didn't mean she never experienced fear or worry again, but those emotions no longer dominated her consciousness or dictated her decisions. The secret pathway to experiencing these subtle shifts is persistence through the initial challenges. This is precisely where many spiritual seekers stumble on their journey. They begin this practice with enthusiasm, expecting immediate dramatic results, perhaps a miraculous healing or sudden financial windfall. When those instant miracles don't materialize, they conclude the approach doesn't work and abandon it. prematurely, returning to the familiar but limiting material consciousness. The critical insight is understanding that spiritual development follows natural laws just as physical growth does. Think about planting a garden. When you place seeds in soil, nothing visible happens immediately. For days or even weeks, you see no evidence of growth. If you grew impatient and dug up the seeds to check on them, you'd interrupt the very process you're trying to foster. Spiritual practice works similarly. The initial work happens beneath the surface of your awareness, creating a foundation for visible transformation that appears in divine timing. Those who persist through this initial phase discover something far more valuable than instant gratification. An inner resource that sustains them through everything life brings. They develop a spiritual resilience that isn't dependent on circumstances being perfect. Subscribe now to continue this journey of spiritual discovery with us. We're dedicated to translating these profound mystical insights into practical steps you can apply immediately in your relationships, work, and inner peace. A businessman shared with me that after 6 months of consistent practice, he faced a crisis that would have previously sent him into panic and despair. Instead, he found himself responding from kingdom consciousness automatically without the effort it had required earlier in his journey. The practice that had once seemed difficult had become his natural state. This represents the maturation of spiritual awareness. What begins as conscious effort gradually becomes spontaneous expression. If you're committed to discovering the kingdom within, regardless of how long it takes, write in the comments, "I'm in this for the long journey." Now, I want to explore perhaps the most profound transformation that occurs when we remove the barriers to divine flow, the way it completely reimagines our relationships with others. Think about the people who challenge you most, that co-worker who constantly criticizes, the family member who triggers old wounds, or the stranger who cuts you off in traffic. Our instinctive reaction is defensiveness, judgment, or withdrawal. But kingdom consciousness offers an entirely different pathway when interacting with difficult people. The breakthrough insight is recognizing that the divine presence exists within them too, perfect even when obscured by stress, fear, or fatigue. Their behavior may not reflect this spiritual reality, but that doesn't diminish its truth. This recognition isn't about excusing harmful actions, but about seeing beyond the surface to the deeper reality. Imagine returning home after a challenging day to find your partner irritable and distant. From material consciousness, you'd likely react defensively or withdraw emotionally. But from kingdom consciousness, you recognize that they're dealing with their own challenges, that the divine presence within them remains perfect even when obscured. This recognition allows you to respond with compassion rather than escalating the tension. I witnessed this transformation in a corporate environment where 2 executives had been locked in conflict for months. After one began practicing kingdom consciousness, the entire dynamic shifted. Rather than reacting to perceived attacks, she began seeing her colleague through spiritual eyes, recognizing the pressure he was under and the divine intelligence operating even through his challenging personality. Without a single conversation about their conflict, the relationship transformed as her perception shifted. The revelation many spiritual seekers miss is that living from kingdom consciousness doesn't mean escaping daily challenges, but meeting them from a spiritual foundation. This isn't about floating above human experience in some mystical bubble. It's about engaging fully with life's complexities while maintaining awareness of the spiritual dimension behind all appearances. This journey includes both successes and setbacks. Some days you'll maintain spiritual awareness beautifully throughout challenges. Other days you'll fail completely and spend hours in anxiety or anger before remembering the kingdom within. This inconsistency isn't evidence of failure, but the normal rhythm of spiritual development. Behind the scenes of spiritual growth, each return to kingdom consciousness after forgetting builds neural pathways that make this awareness increasingly natural. What initially requires conscious effort gradually becomes your default perspective. The businessman who once struggled to maintain spiritual awareness for even minutes eventually finds it becoming his natural state throughout the day. The decision to practice kingdom consciousness transforms ordinary moments into opportunities for spiritual recognition. Washing dishes becomes a meditation on divine presence. Traffic delays offer space for inner communion. Challenging conversations become invitations to see beyond appearances to the spiritual reality within others. Life itself becomes your spiritual practice, an ongoing opportunity to remove the barriers that block divine flow. The beauty of this approach is how it infuses even the most mundane activities with profound meaning. That stack of paperwork on your desk? No longer just tedious tasks, but opportunities to express divine order and intelligence. The grocery shopping. Not just errands, but a chance to recognize abundance flowing through every aspect of your experience. If you've experienced those moments when spiritual awareness suddenly breaks through in the midst of ordinary activities, write in the comments, "I recognize divinity in the everyday." The true beauty of this practice emerges when we observe how it gradually transforms our entire experience of life. Over months and years of dedicated practice, something truly profound begins to shift in your awareness. The kingdom consciousness that once required deliberate effort becomes increasingly natural, like learning a language that eventually allows you to think in it, rather than mentally translating every phrase. You'll notice that you automatically return to spiritual truth more quickly after being momentarily pulled into material fear or concern. This isn't something you force. It's the natural evolution of consistent spiritual recognition. Think of it as building momentum on a journey. Those initial steps require the most energy, but as you continue forward, you develop a rhythm that carries you naturally. A friend described this experience beautifully, saying that after a year of practice, she realized her first thought in challenging situations had shifted from panic to peace. Not because she was trying to be spiritual, but because kingdom consciousness had become her default perspective. The evidence of this transformation appears in practical ways throughout your life. Solutions to problems appear more readily because you're accessing the infinite intelligence of the kingdom within, rather than relying solely on limited personal thinking. Peace becomes more consistent because it's anchored in spiritual reality rather than fluctuating circumstances. Relationships deepen because you're interacting from authentic spiritual awareness rather than ego needs and defenses. The hidden revelation that transforms this journey is letting go of expectations for immediate dramatic results. Our culture conditions us to expect instant transformation, the spiritual equivalent of before and after photos on a weight loss program. But consciousness doesn't transform that way. The changes unfold organically, often so subtly that you don't notice them happening in real time. You may not even recognize the cumulative effect until you look back after 6 months or a year and realize how profoundly different your life has become. One of the most remarkable transformations occurs in your professional life. As kingdom consciousness becomes your natural state, work shifts from being merely a means of survival to an authentic expression of divine creativity flowing through you. This isn't just a nice spiritual idea. It manifests in tangible ways that transform your entire relationship with your career or business. A designer in our community described this shift beautifully. Where she once struggled for inspiration, constantly fighting creative blocks and deadline pressure, she now experiences a natural flow of ideas because she's tapped into infinite intelligence rather than relying solely on personal ability. Her work became not just more productive, but more fulfilling, an expression of spiritual essence rather than ego achievement. The behind-the-scenes revelation is how this consciousness transforms your relationship with challenges. Obstacles that would have previously overwhelmed you begin to feel like interesting puzzles to solve from spiritual awareness. A project deadline that once triggered anxiety now becomes an opportunity to witness divine ideas emerging in perfect timing. A difficult client interaction that would have sparked defensiveness becomes a chance to recognize the kingdom within both yourself and the other person. If you've started to notice your work becoming more of an authentic expression of something greater than yourself, write in the comments, "I'm becoming a clear channel." Now, I want to go even deeper into what may be the most significant breakthrough on this journey of removing the barriers to divine flow. As kingdom consciousness matures through consistent practice, you discover something precious beyond measure, an unshakable peace that doesn't depend on circumstances being perfect. This isn't positive thinking or emotional bypass. It's authentic spiritual awareness that remains steady through life's inevitable fluctuations. This peace becomes your foundation through every challenge, loss, and disappointment. When financial setbacks occur, you still take practical action, but without the paralysis of fear. When relationships face difficulties, you address them directly, but without the drama of emotional reactivity. When health concerns arise, you seek appropriate care, but without being consumed by worry about outcomes. A woman who had practiced kingdom consciousness for several years faced the unexpected loss of a spouse. Friends were amazed at her response, not an absence of grief, but a profound peace that coexisted with natural sorrow. She described knowing beyond intellectual understanding that the kingdom of heaven within had proven itself faithful through the darkest experience of her life. This wasn't resignation or spiritual bypassing, but direct experience of spiritual reality, transcending even death itself. This represents the maturation of spiritual understanding, moving from conceptual knowledge to lived reality. You know from direct experience that spiritual consciousness is the only reliable foundation because you've tested it through real-life challenges. Material conditions fluctuate constantly, but inner truth remains eternally steady. This doesn't make you immune to human emotion, but provides a deeper context for those emotions, like waves on the surface of an ocean that remains undisturbed in its depths. Let's be honest about what this path truly requires. The transformation we're discussing demands a level of commitment that most spiritual seekers are unwilling to make. This isn't a weekend workshop or a 21-day challenge that produces instant enlightenment. It requires daily practice, even when you feel absolutely no immediate results. Faith in spiritual truth when material appearances seem to contradict it completely. And patience through the sometimes painfully gradual development process. Joel Goldsmith taught this path to thousands of students worldwide throughout his ministry. Some experienced dramatic breakthroughs within months. Others worked diligently for years before significant changes appeared visibly in their experience. A few grew impatient and abandoned the practice when immediate miracles failed to materialize. The decisive factor wasn't spiritual talent or divine favoritism, but simple persistence, the willingness to continue recognizing spiritual truth regardless of apparent results. This commitment represents a fundamental paradigm shift in our approach to spiritual growth. Our culture has conditioned us to expect immediate gratification in every area of life, from instant downloads to same-day delivery. We bring this same expectation to spiritual practice, wanting instant enlightenment or immediate healing. The revelation that transforms your journey is accepting that spiritual development follows natural laws that cannot be rushed or circumvented. If you've experienced that profound peace that transcends understanding, even briefly during a difficult time, write in the comments, "I've felt the kingdom's steadiness." The profound insight that stands at this crossroads of your spiritual journey is that you can begin right now, exactly where you are, with whatever understanding you currently possess. You don't need to master complex theology or achieve perfect meditation first. You don't need special spiritual credentials or decades of study. The kingdom of heaven is within you right now. It has always been there. It will always be there. Your recognition doesn't create it, but simply reveals what already exists eternally. This is perhaps the most liberating revelation of all. The divine flow isn't blocked by your lack of knowledge or spiritual achievement. It's only blocked by a misperception about where God actually is. The transformation begins with a single moment of recognition. The kingdom of heaven is within me now. Divine presence is my true nature. Spiritual perfection exists in consciousness regardless of material appearances. Simply start today, this moment, by recognizing as often as you remember this fundamental truth. Practice this recognition in the morning, throughout challenges before sleep. Be patient with yourself through the inevitable inconsistency. Celebrate small victories. Learn from temporary setbacks. What makes this approach uniquely powerful is that it doesn't require you to change who you are or adopt artificial spiritual behaviors. It simply invites you to recognize your true nature that has always existed beneath the surface of material appearances. Every time you turn within to acknowledge this spiritual truth, you're removing another layer of illusion that has kept you imprisoned in limitation and fear. The barriers to divine flow begin dissolving naturally through consistent recognition rather than through spiritual force or willpower. This isn't about creating something new, but unveiling what has always been there. The journey of awakening to kingdom consciousness doesn't happen in isolation. As your awareness deepens, it naturally ripples outward and touches countless lives. Around you, spiritual truth isn't meant to be held tightly as intellectual knowledge, but shared openly as lived experience. As the barriers to divine flow dissolve in your consciousness, you naturally become a clearer channel for this truth to reach others. This sharing rarely happens through preaching or persuasion. It occurs organically through your transformed presence. People notice the difference in how you respond to challenges, the peace you maintain in chaos, the compassion you extend. Where judgment once dominated, they're drawn to something they sense in you that they intuitively recognize as authentic. A business executive described how, after practicing kingdom consciousness for nearly 2 years, his entire leadership style transformed. Where he once led through force and fear, he now inspired through spiritual presence. His decisions emerged from inner listening rather than external pressure. Team members didn't necessarily know the source of this transformation, but they responded to its authenticity. This represents the maturation of spiritual understanding, moving from intellectually appreciating concepts to embodying them naturally in everyday interactions. You become a living demonstration that removing the barriers to divine flow creates not just personal transformation, but a ripple effect of healing in all your relationships and environments. If this understanding of becoming a clear channel for divine expression resonates with something deep within you, write in the comments, "The kingdom flows through me." As we draw this conversation to a close, I'm reminded of something profound that Joel Goldsmith often emphasized. Spiritual truth isn't meant to be held tightly as intellectual knowledge, but shared openly as lived experience. Your journey of recognizing the kingdom within doesn't happen in isolation. It ripples outward and touches countless lives around you. If these teachings have resonated with something deep within you today, I'd love to hear about your own experiences in the comments below. Simply write, "The kingdom within awakens," so I know you've journeyed with me to the end of this exploration. Your story might be exactly what another seeker needs to hear to begin their own practice of recognition. If you found value in this perspective on stopping the blockage of divine flow, consider gently tapping that like button, not for algorithms or metrics, but as a way of affirming that spiritual truth still matters in our distracted world. It's a small gesture that helps others discover these timeless principles. And if you're feeling called to continue this journey of spiritual discovery together, subscribe to join our growing community of seekers committed to recognizing the divine presence in everyday life. We're exploring these profound truths every week, translating mystical understanding into practical living. There's a video right here about practicing the presence throughout your day that builds beautifully on what we've discussed today. Click and continue with me over there as we explore how to maintain spiritual awareness through the specific challenges and opportunities of daily living. Until next time, remember, the kingdom of heaven is within you right now, waiting only for your recognition.
My friends, let us come together in the spirit of quiet receptivity. Let us set aside for a moment all the noise that surrounds this subject, all the debates, all the arguments, all the claims and counterclaims that have filled the world with confusion. Let us meet here, not to defend a position, not to prove a point, but to rest in the gentle recognition that truth reveals itself only in stillness. There is much said today about Christ consciousness. Some embrace it with enthusiasm. Others reject it with fear or suspicion. Many are uncertain, pulled between voices that speak loudly in opposite directions. One group declares that this teaching is the highest revelation. Another insists that it is deception. And between these two extremes, the sincere seeker is left wondering what to believe. But, my friends, truth is never found in argument. It is never discovered in controversy. It does not reveal itself through noise, excitement, or emotional persuasion. Truth appears only when we become quiet enough inwardly to let the still small voice be heard. The question, is Christ consciousness a deception, arises only when we have mistaken the Christ for something external to ourselves, or when we have imagined that the Christ is a personal attainment, a human achievement, or an elevated identity of the ego. These misunderstandings have spread far and wide, and because of them, many who seek honestly have been turned away from the very truth that would set them free. So let us begin by laying one foundation, and let this foundation remain clear in your mind throughout our time together. Christ consciousness is not a theory. It is not a philosophy. It is not a belief system, nor is it a psychological process. Christ consciousness is not something invented by human minds, nor is it a modern innovation. It is the eternal truth of your being, the truth that Jesus revealed, the truth that every mystic has discovered when they turned within and found the presence living itself at the center of their own being. We are not here to concern ourselves with what the world says about Christ consciousness. The world speaks from fear, from misunderstanding, from personal opinions. We are here to concern ourselves with what the Spirit reveals. And the Spirit speaks only one language, the language of inner recognition. You see, all confusion arises when we attempt to understand spiritual reality from the level of the human mind. The human mind wants definitions. It wants clear categories. It wants to say, this is right and that is wrong. This belongs to my group and that belongs to another. This agrees with my doctrine and that must therefore be dangerous. But the Spirit does not speak in such terms. The Spirit reveals itself in the silence of I. For 2,000 years, the world has spoken about Christ as if Christ were a person, a man separate from us, an individual far removed from our own nature. And because of that, the world has struggled and suffered, searching for God outside, seeking salvation through external forms, never realizing that the very essence of the Christ is the presence that announces itself silently as I am. It is only when we forget that the Christ is the inner light of every soul that we fall into fear and suspicion. It is only when we imagine that Christ is something we can own, defend, or monopolize that we become hostile toward anything that appears to challenge that image. But truth is not threatened by anything. Truth has no fear, for truth is the presence of God, infinite, eternal, and indivisible. So today, let us set aside the fears that have been taught to us. Let us set aside the belief that Christ consciousness is something strange or foreign. Let us forget, for the moment, the voices that have told us it is dangerous or deceptive or contradictory to the teachings of Jesus. Instead, let us come together in a spirit of openness, humility, and quiet expectation. Let us be willing to hear what the Christ within reveals when all personal opinions are set aside. Christ consciousness, as we shall discover, is not a replacement for Jesus. It is the very life that lived as Jesus. It is the presence that spoke through him. It is the light that he embodied so perfectly that humanity could behold it. And that same light is the truth of your identity. You do not attain Christ consciousness. You awaken to it. You do not create it. You recognize it. You do not make yourself worthy of it. You discover that it has always been the essence of your being. This is where we begin, not in fear, not in argument, not in human interpretation, but in the quiet realization that the Christ is not something external to be judged, but something internal to be revealed. Let us walk gently, my friends, for the subject before us is holy. And as we move deeper into this exploration, the controversies will fade away, and the truth will stand on its own, simple, clear, and self-revealing. My friends, before we can determine whether Christ's consciousness is misunderstood or misrepresented, we must first become clear about what the term actually means. And we must become clear in the only way that spiritual clarity ever comes, not through definition alone, not through intellectual analysis, but through recognition. For spiritual truth does not enter through the mind, it reveals itself through the soul. So let us sit quietly for a moment. Let the mind grow still. Let the questions fall away. Let the personal opinions soften. And in that silence, let us listen for the inner meaning of this word Christ, which for so long has been spoken about, argued about, defended, misunderstood, and yet so rarely recognized. When I use the word Christ, I am not speaking of a man. I am not speaking of Jesus' human identity. I am not speaking of a personality who lived 2,000 years ago. When I speak of the Christ, I am speaking of the divine presence that animated Jesus, the Spirit that performed his works, the light that spoke through him and said, I and the Father are one. That light did not begin with Jesus, and it did not end with Jesus. It is the eternal self of every individual waiting to be recognized. Christ is not a person. Christ is the spiritual identity of every soul. Christ is the presence of God appearing as individual being. Christ is the universal selfhood of all who have ever lived and all who ever will. Jesus revealed the Christ. He embodied it. He expressed it without obstruction. But he did not possess it as something unique to himself. He demonstrated it so that you and I might also awaken to that same presence within our own being. This, my friends, is the radical clarity that dissolves confusion. The Christ is not something outside of you. The Christ is the truth of you. Now, let us consider the second word, consciousness. What do we mean by that? Consciousness is not thought, nor is it emotion. It is not belief. It is not imagination. Consciousness is awareness. It is the dimension of your being that knows, that recognizes, that perceives, that is aware of itself as existence. Consciousness is the I that you experience before you attach any qualities to it. When you say, I am, you are speaking from consciousness. When you say, I exist, you are speaking from consciousness. When you are silently aware, without words, without concepts, without images, that is consciousness. Therefore, Christ consciousness is the awareness of your true identity as the Christ, the recognition that the presence of God is the very essence of your being. Christ consciousness is not a new identity you attain. It is the original identity you awaken to. It is not a higher version of the personal self. It is the absence of the personal self. It is not the elevation of the human mind. It is the quieting of the human mind so that the divine mind may shine through. This awareness is not reached through strain or effort. It reveals itself in the same way light appears when clouds part. It was always there, hidden only by a passing veil. The human sense of self says, I am a person, I am separate, I am vulnerable, I am lacking. Christ consciousness reveals, I am the life of God, individualized. I am whole. I am supplied. I am protected, not by force, but by the nature of being itself. The human mind says, I must become spiritual. Christ consciousness whispers, you already are spiritual. You must only realize it. The ego declares, I can achieve. The Christ declares, I can of mine own self do nothing. The Father within me doeth the works. This is the difference between the world's misinterpretation of Christ's consciousness and the truth that Jesus revealed and that I have sought to teach. The world imagines that Christ's consciousness means personal greatness or special abilities. But in truth, it is the end of personal sense, the end of self-will, the end of the belief in separation. Christ consciousness is not the glorification of the human being. It is the disappearance of the human being into the realization of divine presence. When you recognize the Christ within, you do not become more of a person, you become less of a person and more of the presence that has always lived as the reality of your being. This inner recognition quiets fear, dissolves judgment, releases resistance, and allows healing to occur naturally because you are no longer resisting the activity of God as your life. So let us be clear, absolutely clear. Christ consciousness is not a trend, not a doctrine, not a belief, not an invention of any era. It is the eternal nature of your being, revealed by Jesus, taught by the mystics, and discovered by all who have turned within and found the same presence, looking back at them as their own I. And now, with this foundation, we can move deeper. We can begin to examine why so many misunderstand this truth, why some fear it, why some condemn it, and why the world has stumbled over a revelation meant to set humanity free. My friends, when spiritual truth becomes spoken of in the marketplace of human thought, when it is carried from one mind to another without the inner realization that gives it life, it is easily distorted. And because of this, the world has developed many misunderstandings around the idea of Christ consciousness. These misunderstandings are not malicious. They arise simply because the human mind attempts to grasp what can only be known by the Spirit. Let us gently, lovingly, and quietly explore these misunderstandings, not to condemn those who hold them, but to see through them so that the truth may stand unveiled. The first misunderstanding is this, that Christ consciousness is the claim that the human self is divine. Many fear this. They say, how dangerous it is to tell people they are God. What deception lies in telling humanity that it needs no Savior, no Redeemer, no grace. And indeed, If someone were to say, my human personality is divine, my ego is God, that would be deception. It would be delusion, for the ego has no spiritual substance, no permanence, no reality. But, my friends, Christ consciousness never glorifies the ego. It reveals its nothingness. It does not say that the person is divine. It says the person is an appearance through which the divine may shine when the personal sense dissolves. If you have ever truly touched the inner presence, even for a moment, you know that it does not inflate the self, it silences it. It does not exalt the personality, it removes it from the center entirely. It does not make you feel powerful, it makes you feel transparent, as though the presence of God were the only life living itself through you. The second misunderstanding is this, that Christ consciousness replaces Jesus or diminishes his role. Some fear that this teaching takes away from the uniqueness of Jesus, that it denies his divinity or rejects his mission. But nothing could be farther from truth. Christ consciousness does not reduce Jesus. It reveals the true magnitude of what Jesus embodied. It honors him not merely as a man to be worshipped, but as the perfect vehicle of the Christ, the light that is the life of every soul. When Jesus said, "The works that I do, ye shall do also," he was not diminishing himself, he was elevating us. He was showing us that the same presence that operated as his being is the presence that constitutes our being. To recognize Christ within yourself does not dishonor Jesus, it fulfills his teaching. The third misunderstanding is this, that Christ consciousness is a quest for power, manifestation, or spiritual superiority. This misunderstanding arises because the human mind looks for advantage, for accomplishment, for something it can attain. And so some have taught Christ consciousness as though it were a method to gain spiritual strength, attract material good, or achieve mystical abilities. But this is not Christ consciousness. This is the ego seeking spiritual clothing. The true Christ reveals its own nature. I can of mine own self do nothing. This is the heartbeat of Christ consciousness. It is not the assertion of personal power, it is the surrender of personal will. It is the recognition that God, the infinite invisible, is the only presence acting through us as life, as mind, as supply, as love. The fourth misunderstanding is this, that Christ consciousness is part of an occult or New Age movement. This belief arises because, in the absence of true understanding, people group ideas together based on words rather than on essence. They hear phrases that sound unfamiliar, or they encounter individuals who use the term loosely, without reverence, without realization, and so they assume that Christ consciousness is simply another modern trend. But, my friends, Christ consciousness is ancient. It is older than Christianity, older than religion, older than any sacred text. It is the eternal truth of being existing before Abraham, before Moses, before the prophets, before the world was formed. It is the I, the divine awareness, that is the very foundation of your existence. The problem is never the term. The problem is always the level of consciousness from which it is spoken. When spoken from the human mind, Christ consciousness becomes a concept misunderstood and misused. When spoken from the Spirit, it becomes the revelation of the one presence, the one power, the one life, expressing as all, and so the confusion arises not because Christ consciousness is deceptive, but because human interpretation is always limited. The mind tries to grasp what can only be lived, and when the mind grasps, it distorts. When the Spirit reveals, it illumines. Let us therefore be very gentle with those who fear this teaching. Let us be patient with those who condemn it. They are not opposing truth, they are protecting the image of truth they have inherited. They fear the loss of the familiar. They fear anything that appears to challenge their understanding of God and salvation. And fear, my friends, is only the result of not yet having felt the presence within. For when Christ is recognized as the inner light of your own being, all fear dissolves, all resistance falls away, and you discover that what once seemed threatening is, in fact, the very truth that leads you into freedom. Let us move forward now, deeper into the heart of this matter, and see what the Christ truly is when all misconceptions are set aside. My friends, now that we have seen the misunderstandings that cloud this subject, let us turn our attention to the true nature of the Christ. For unless this is clearly understood, everything else will remain confused. Everything else will remain tangled in the beliefs of the world. And the Christ, which is simple, which is ever present, which is nearer than breath, will seem distant, mysterious, and veiled. Let us begin with a very quiet realization. The Christ is not a religious term. The Christ is not a theological idea. The Christ is not a historical figure. The Christ is the living presence of God, individualized as your own being. It is the spiritual identity of every soul, whether recognized or unrecognized, whether realized or unrealized. It is the invisible, infinite essence of life that stands behind the appearance of form. It is the silent reality that Jesus embodied and revealed. When Jesus walked this earth, what made him the Christ was not his body, not his birth, not his lineage, not his personality. What made him the Christ was his transparency to the presence, his utter absence of personal selfhood. His life was a window through which the Father could shine without obstruction. He did not possess the Christ possessed him. He did not claim divinity for his human self. He surrendered his human self so completely that only the divine remained. And so, the Christ is not something Jesus had that you do not possess. The Christ is not a special attribute reserved for one man. The Christ is not the exclusive property of any religion or any doctrine. The Christ is the universal presence of God expressed as individual being. Now, let us be very clear. This does not mean the human personality is divine. It does not mean your human opinions, your human emotions, your human desires, your human ego are the Christ. No. The Christ is the I behind the I that you speak every day, the spiritual identity behind the human name, the divine essence behind the human life. When you say, I am, before you add any description to it, before you say, I am tired, or I am discouraged, or I am joyful, or I am afraid, there is a pure I that stands alone. That I is the Christ. It is the light that Jesus spoke from when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He did not mean I, the man. He meant the eternal I that spoke through him. This is why he could say, before Abraham was, I am. Not I was, not I existed, but I am. The Christ is timeless. The Christ is birthless and deathless. The Christ is not bound to form, yet expresses through form. The Christ is not limited by matter, yet appears in matter. The Christ is not the body, yet animates the body. And this Christ, this eternal divine identity, is the truth of every individual on the face of the earth. It is the same in the saint and in the sinner, though recognized in one and hidden in the other. It is the same in the wise and in the ignorant, though shining through one and veiled in the other. It is the same in those who embrace it and in those who deny it. Christ is not created by belief. Christ is not destroyed by disbelief. Christ is the reality of being. You see, my friends, the moment you separate Christ from yourself and place it on a pedestal far away, belonging to another, you lose the message Jesus came to reveal. The world has worshiped Jesus while missing the Christ. It has adored the messenger while ignoring the message. It has elevated him so high above humanity that his teaching became impossible to follow. But Jesus did not come to show what one man can do through special divine favor. He came to show what God is doing every moment as the life of every individual. His mission was not to create worshipers. His mission was to awaken sons and daughters of the living God to their true identity. Now let us consider another clarity. The Christ does not deny the human experience. It does not ignore pain. It does not pretend suffering is unreal on the human level. It does not call the body unimportant or the world illusion in a careless way. But it reveals that these appearances do not define you. They do not have power over your true being. They are not the final truth of what you are. Christ consciousness in its purity does not say, deny your experience. It says, do not identify with your experience. There is a vast difference. When you look at your life and say, I am sick, you give the condition your name. You place the label of divinity upon a passing appearance. But when you look at the same condition and say inwardly, the I that I am is not touched by this appearance, then you are resting in the Christ. You are recognizing the truth behind the form. You are acknowledging the presence that stands where the problem seems to be. The Christ is not about escaping life. The Christ is not about transcending responsibility. The Christ is not about withdrawing from the world. The Christ is the light that reveals reality within the world. The Christ is the presence that lifts consciousness out of fear even while the outer experience continues. The Christ is the inner assurance that nothing real can be harmed and nothing unreal can endure. And so, let us gently come into this recognition. The Christ is the divine self of you, not your ego, not your personality, not your intellect, not your emotions. The Christ is the presence of God, living itself as you, speaking itself as you, moving itself as you, being itself through you. When this is seen, even dimly, even faintly, the fear of deception melts away, for nothing can deceive the one who recognizes presence. Nothing can mislead the one who has found the source within. Nothing can frighten the one who has discovered the divine I behind all appearances. Let us hold this quietly in our hearts as we continue deeper into this revelation. My friends, having opened our hearts to the true nature of the Christ, it is now time to speak with loving clarity about something that has misled many sincere seekers. It is a gentle warning, not a rebuke. It is an invitation to discernment, not a call to judgment. For in the world, there are two versions of what people call Christ consciousness. One is born of the Spirit, the other is a product of the human mind. They share the same words, but they do not share the same essence. They use the same language, but they do not lead to the same realization. Let us explore this with patience and humility, so that the inner truth may stand revealed without confusion or fear. The first version, the ego's interpretation of Christ consciousness. There is a form of teaching abroad today which uses the term Christ consciousness, but does not carry the Christ within it. It speaks of awakening, but what awakens is not the spirit, it is the ego in spiritual clothing. It speaks of power, but the power it seeks is personal. It speaks of manifestation, but the things it desires to manifest are the objects of human want. It speaks of divinity, but it assigns divinity to the personal sense of self. This version says, you can become godlike. You can command the universe. You can shape reality as you choose. You can elevate your human self to divine status. My friends, the Christ has nothing to do with such claims. These are the longings of the human mind seeking spiritual authority. They are attempts to turn the infinite into a servant of personal desire. They are efforts to use God rather than surrender to God. This version of Christ consciousness is not wicked. It is simply mistaken. It is born from the belief that personal will can be infused with spiritual power. It elevates the person instead of dissolving the person. It seeks to acquire instead of to yield. It pursues experiences instead of presence. And because of this misunderstanding, many fear Christ consciousness and call it deception. They see this ego-centered version and assume it represents the whole. But this is not the Christ. It is the echo of the human mind trying to touch the divine without relinquishing itself. The second version, the Christ consciousness Goldsmith taught. Now let us turn to the true version, the version that Jesus embodied, the version that the mystics discovered, the version that I have spent a lifetime attempting to reveal. This Christ consciousness does not elevate the human self. It reveals its unreality. It does not make the ego powerful. It dissolves the ego entirely. It does not give you spiritual authority. It reveals that only God is authority. It does not teach you to manifest. It teaches you to rest in the fullness that already is. This Christ consciousness whispers, "Of mine own self I can do nothing. The Father within me doeth the works. I and the Father are one. The kingdom of God is within you." Here, no personal self remains to claim anything. Here, no human agenda survives. Here, no earthly desire can persist in the light of the presence. And because there is no personal self seeking its own fulfillment, there is peace, profound, unshakable peace. There is a sense of harmony with all life. There is a natural flow of supply that requires no manipulation. There is healing, not as a miracle performed by a person, but as a natural consequence of resting in the presence that is already whole. This is the Christ consciousness that Jesus lived. This is the Christ consciousness that reveals itself in pure silence. This is the Christ consciousness that removes all fear of deception, for it removes the very self that could be deceived. The difference between the two versions. And so, let us state the distinction simply and clearly. The ego's version says, "I become greater." The Christ version says, the personal I disappears and the divine I am shines forth. The ego's version seeks power. The Christ version relinquishes power, for God alone is power. The ego's version wants to attract things. The Christ version recognizes, "The Father knoweth what things ye have need of." The ego's version tries to create reality. The Christ version beholds reality already present. The ego's version looks outward. The Christ version looks inward to the still sanctuary of being. One inflates the human self, the other reveals the divine self. One speaks loudly, the other speaks in the whisper of inner silence. One creates confusion, the other creates peace. One leads away from God, the other reveals that God has never been absent. Why this clarification matters? My friends, it is essential to distinguish these two versions gently and clearly, because many reject the true teaching after encountering the false one. They see the ego's imitation, and they recoil from the entire subject. They turn away from the very truth that could liberate them. But when the heart hears the authentic message, the message of surrender, of silence, of inner recognition, all fear dissolves. For the true Christ consciousness is nothing more and nothing less than the presence of God revealing itself as your own being. There is no danger in this. There is no deception in this. There is only peace. There is only light. There is only the gentle unveiling of what you already are in reality. Let us now continue deeper into this sacred truth, so that the confusion of the world may fall away and the clarity of spirit may speak within us. My friends, if we desire clarity about the true nature of Christ consciousness, there is no higher authority than the words of the Master himself. For Jesus did not come merely to be admired. He came to reveal the inner light that is the life of every individual. He did not come to display personal greatness. He came to unveil the presence that stands behind all form. And so today we turn to his own statements, for within them lies the spiritual key to Christ consciousness. Not a theory, not a philosophy, a living revelation. Let us approach these words not intellectually, but quietly. Let us allow them to enter not the mind, but the heart. One, I and the Father are one. My friends, this one statement, when truly understood, is the whole of Christ consciousness. When Jesus spoke these words, he did not speak as a man declaring his uniqueness. He spoke from the Christ, revealing the universal truth of being. He was not dividing himself from humanity. He was revealing the nature of all creation. I and the Father are one does not mean the man Jesus was one with God while you remain separate. It means that the divine I which spoke through Jesus is the same I that is the life of every soul. The Father is the invisible source. The Christ is the expression of that source. And the I of you, the real you, the spiritual you, is that expression. This is not arrogance. This is not blasphemy. This is not self-exaltation. This is recognition. This is the moment when the veil of separation dissolves, when you realize that your life is God's life, that your being is God's being, that your existence is God's expression. This is the first step into the Christ 2. The Father within me doeth the works. Here lies the end of personal ego. Here lies the death of the belief that we are separate, individual beings with private minds and private powers. Jesus did not say, I perform miracles through spiritual techniques. He did not say, I heal with my mind. He did not say, I manifest through personal mastery. He said, the Father within me doeth the works. This is the essence of Christ consciousness. God is the only presence. God is the only mind. God is the only power. God is the only doer. And when the human self steps aside, when the personal I falls into silence, the divine I am shines forth, and healing occurs naturally, not as a supernatural event, but as the activity of reality revealing itself. When you know, even in a small measure, that the Father within you does the works, you cease struggling. You cease trying to fix the world. You cease attempting to manipulate circumstances. You enter the rest that Jesus lived in every moment. This is Christ consciousness. 3. The kingdom of God is within you. With these words, Jesus removed God from every external location. He removed God from the heavens above. He removed God from temples and holy mountains. He removed God from rituals and systems. He removed God from doctrines and institutions. He placed God in the only place where God can ever truly be realized within you. Not within your mind, not within your emotions, not within your imagination, but within your consciousness, the silent, living presence at the center of your being. Every spiritual journey that seeks God outside must eventually fail. Every attempt to reach God through external means must eventually collapse. Every religious practice that overlooks the inner kingdom remains incomplete. Christ consciousness begins when you turn inward, not to find something new, but to discover what has been there eternally. 4. The works that I do, you shall do also, and greater works than these shall you do. My friends, this is not poetry. It is not metaphor. It is not exaggeration. It is spiritual fact. Jesus did not come to declare his superiority. He came to reveal your identity. He came to show what God can do when a human sense of self no longer obstructs the fullness of the presence. When he says, "You shall do the works," he is saying, the same Christ that lived as me lives as you. Not the ego, not the personality, not the conditioned mind, but the eternal Christ, the divine I, the presence of God manifesting as individual being. He was not elevating humanity through flattery. He was unveiling reality. Do not let the world convince you this is heresy. Do not let fear tell you this is presumption. Do not let doctrines tell you this is reserved for one man. If only one man on earth was one with the Father, then the teaching of Jesus would be a contradiction. But if the Christ is the light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world, then the teaching is fulfilled. This is why Christ consciousness is not deception, it is destiny. 5. Lo, I am with you always. What is this I? It is not the man who lived in Galilee. It is not the historical personality. It is not a figure that comes and goes in time. This I is the eternal presence, the divine identity, the Christ within, the light that is the life of every soul. When Jesus says, "I am with you," he means the divine presence is your own being. It cannot leave you. It cannot abandon you. It cannot be lost. When you discover this, fear dissolves. Loneliness dissolves. Suffering softens. And you awaken to the truth that you have never been separate from God for one instant. This is the heart of Christ consciousness, bringing his words together. His statements form a single, unbroken revelation. Oneness with the Father as the doer, the kingdom within, the universality of divine realization, the eternal presence of the I am. These are not the claims of a human being. These are the declarations of the Christ, speaking through the transparency of Jesus. When these statements are heard inwardly, not as beliefs, but as revelations, the personal sense of self begins to dissolve, and the divine self begins to shine through. That shining forth is Christ consciousness. Let us hold these words in silence for a moment, letting them enter deeply until the meaning begins to awaken from within. My friends, now that we have looked upon the words of the Master, let us move into the living of these truths. For Christ consciousness cannot be reached through intellect, through emotion, through repetition, or through effort. It is not attained as one attains a skill. It is not acquired as one acquires knowledge. It is not summoned as one summons a power. Christ consciousness is recognized. It is revealed. It is awakened from within. It is allowed, not achieved. It is permitted, not produced. And so our task is not to climb toward God, but to remove the veils that hide the presence already here. Let us walk gently through the essential practices that reveal this inner light. Not techniques, but openings. Not methods, but recognitions. 1. The still moment. Be still and know. Every realization begins with stillness. Not physical stillness alone, though that helps. Not forced quietness, though silence is its friend, but the inner stillness in which the personal self loosens its grip. Goldsmith taught what Jesus lived. You cannot know God while the mind is busy trying to know God. You cannot receive the Christ while asking the Christ to come. You cannot hear the still, small voice while shouting your desires into the silence. So we enter a sacred moment not to think, not to ask, not to repeat, not to imagine, but simply to rest in the presence that is already here. In that moment, we gently let go. Let go of trying to reach God. Let go of trying to understand truth. Let go of trying to fix life. Let go of trying to become spiritual. And in the quiet that remains, the Christ begins to reveal itself. 2. The practice of recognition, I am, is here. Recognition is not affirmation. Recognition is not positive thinking. Recognition is not mental repetition. Recognition is simply awareness of what already is. Goldsmith would enter meditation not to change conditions, but to recognize the presence that stands behind conditions. Quietly, inwardly, he would rest in the recognition. I am the presence of God, being itself, not the body, not the mind, not the personality, but the invisible presence expressing as this being. This is not something to repeat mechanically. It is something to feel softly, inwardly, like a whisper from within your own being. As you rest in recognition, the human sense of I begins to soften. The boundaries of personal identity dissolve. You feel the shift from me trying to realize God to God realizing itself as me. This is the beginning of Christ-conscious awareness. 3. Impersonalizing appearances. This is not about me. One of the profound keys Goldsmith taught is this: no discord has anything to do with your true identity. It is the impersonal activity of universal belief appearing in your experience. When you say, I am sick, I am afraid, I am struggling, you place the holy name of God, I am, on what is not truth. But when you say inwardly, this appearance is not personal. It is not about my spiritual identity. It is only a universal belief showing itself. You withdraw the power that sustains the appearance. This does not deny the human experience. It denies that the experience defines you. Christ consciousness is the recognition that no condition can touch the divine identity that you truly are. When you stop taking appearances personally, you stop giving them power. And when you stop giving them power, they dissolve, not always instantly, but inevitably. 4. The inner listening. Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. Christ consciousness is not discovered through speaking to God. It is discovered through listening. There is a presence within you that knows. There is a wisdom within you that guides. There is a love within you that heals. There is a peace within you that restores. But this inner teacher speaks in silence. Goldsmith would say, do not pray for anything. Become still and listen. Listen not with the ears, but with the heart. Listen for the wordless assurance that rises not from your thoughts, but from the very ground of your being. Sometimes the silence itself is the answer. Sometimes the peace itself is the guidance. Sometimes the stillness itself is the healing. Christ consciousness is a listening state, a yielding state, a surrendered state. 5. Resting without agenda. Thy will be done. One of the greatest obstacles to Christ recognition is the desire to use spiritual awareness for personal outcomes. When you enter meditation hoping to fix the body, you remain identified with the body. When you seek supply, you remain identified with lack. When you seek peace, you remain identified with fear. But when you enter meditation with no agenda, not to get, not to solve, not to change, you step into the atmosphere of the Christ. Christ consciousness has no purpose other than the revelation of God. When God is revealed, everything else unfolds naturally. You cannot serve two masters. You cannot seek spiritual truth while secretly seeking personal benefit. Rest in the presence and let the presence take care of what belongs to it. This is the way of the Christ. 6. Recognizing the Christ in others. Inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these. Goldsmith taught that the Christ in you cannot be realized fully until you begin recognizing the Christ in every individual. This does not mean approving their actions. It does not mean ignoring their faults. It does not mean excusing their behavior. It means seeing beneath the surface appearance, seeing the same divine identity in them that you are discovering in yourself. This recognition shifts your entire relationship to the world. People cease to be obstacles. People cease to be enemies. People cease to be sources of threat. They become mirrors through which you learn to see the same Christ light shining everywhere. This recognition is not sentimental. It is not emotional. It is a spiritual act that dissolves the sense of separation, and when separation dissolves, Christ consciousness emerges. 7. Returning again and again, a daily unfoldment. Christ consciousness is not attained in a single moment. It is the fruit of daily recognition, daily surrender, daily listening, daily resting. Goldsmith's realization unfolded over decades, not because God is slow, but because the human sense must loosen gradually. Each moment of recognition plants a seed. Each moment of stillness lifts a veil. Each moment of impersonalization dissolves a false belief. Each moment of inner listening unveils a new depth. And over time, sometimes suddenly, sometimes quietly, a shift occurs. You begin to live more from presence than from personality, more from spirit than from thought, more from Christ than from self. This is Christ consciousness. 8. The natural fruits: peace, guidance, healing, supply. Goldsmith never pursued these fruits. He simply recognized the presence, and the fruits followed naturally. Peace comes, guidance comes, healing comes, supply comes. Harmony comes not because you sought them, but because the Christ presence is harmony itself. You cannot seek Christ consciousness for results, but the revelation of the Christ always expresses itself as wholeness. This is the law of spirit. This is the nature of reality. This is the fulfillment of Jesus' words. Seek ye first the kingdom, and all these things shall be added. My friends, these practices are not steps. They are openings. They are doorways. They are invitations to allow the presence to reveal itself. Christ consciousness is not gained. It is unhidden. You do not transform yourself into something divine. You remove what hides the divinity already present. Let us move now into the heart of this transformation, into what happens when this inner recognition becomes lived, embodied, expressed. My friends, let us now enter the sacred territory that few dare to describe, not because it is forbidden, but because it cannot be understood until it is lived. And yet, it is helpful, comforting, and clarifying to hear what unfolds when the Christ begins to take form in your consciousness. For this is not a sudden event. This is not a thunderbolt from the sky. This is not a blinding illumination that leaves the personality transformed in an instant. This is a gentle quickening, a quiet awakening, an inner shift that changes the entire foundation of how you live, how you perceive, how you respond, how you exist. Let us walk through this slowly, reverently. 1. The dissolving of fear. The first evidence that Christ consciousness is dawning within you is not spiritual power. It is not mystical ability. It is not the attraction of good fortune. It is the dissolving of fear, not through willpower, not through courage, not through affirmations or positivity, but through recognition. When the presence within you becomes real, not as belief, not as hope, not as imagination, but as inner certainty, you discover that nothing external has power over your life. Nothing external can touch the reality of your being. Fear dissolves not because life becomes easier, but because you cease to live from the part of you that can be frightened. The personal self fears. The Christ self does not. When you live from the Christ within, fear simply loses its foundation. It has nothing to cling to. It cannot take root. it cannot grow. You become anchored not in emotion, but in presence. 2. A quiet inner authority emerges when Christ consciousness begins to operate. A new form of inner knowing arises, not arrogance, not confidence, not boldness, but spiritual assurance. You begin to feel, I need not be shaken by appearances. I need not rush to fix. I need not defend. I need not resist. I need only rest. This inner authority is not the authority of the human will. It is the authority of the presence that says quietly, I am here. This is the same presence that stood calm before the winds at Galilee. The same presence that walked through crowds unharmed. The same presence that said, peace be still. When Christ is realized, this authority becomes your atmosphere. Not because you claim it, but because it reveals itself. 3. Problems lose their power over you. My friends, this is perhaps the most transformative shift. Problems may still appear, but the sense that they are your problems dissolves. You begin to see every challenge not as a personal burden, but as an opportunity to rest in truth. A financial problem appears, but the anxiety is absent, for you know that supply is the infinite fullness of God, and that supply cannot be withheld. A health concern arises, but the panic is gone, for you know the body is not the source of life, and life cannot be threatened. Our relationship conflicts surface, but the defensiveness is missing, for you know the Christ in you meets the Christ in the other, and harmony unfolds through recognition. Problems do not magically vanish. Your relationship to them transforms, and because of that transformation, the problems begin to shift, dissolve, reorganize, or pass away, not through effort, but through consciousness. 4. Daily life slows into presence. One of the signs that Christ consciousness is unfolding is that your whole experience of time changes. You move more slowly, not physically, but inwardly. There is a sense of spaciousness around every activity. You perform ordinary tasks with a quiet awareness of the presence accompanying you. You do not rush. You do not strain. You do not live reactively. You begin to experience what Jesus meant when he said, My peace I give unto you. This peace is not the absence of activity. It is the presence within activity. You may be busy outwardly, but inwardly you are resting, listening, abiding. Your life becomes a continuous meditation, not something you do, something you are. 5. Healing occurs in a new way. Healing no longer comes from trying to fix the body or the mind or the world. Healing comes from the revelation of truth. You begin to witness, not imagine, not affirm, not hope, that every condition of discord is the manifestation of a false belief. And the moment truth is recognized, the belief loses its substance and the appearance dissolves. Healing becomes natural, unforced, effortless, sometimes gradual, sometimes sudden, always peaceful. Christ consciousness does not heal as a power. Christ consciousness reveals that there is nothing to heal in the first place, only truth to be known. 6. Supply becomes a flow instead of a pursuit. You cease chasing after good. You stop trying to attract prosperity. You stop believing there is something external you must obtain. Instead, you begin to feel the presence of God as the fullness of your life. Supply comes as needed, not through manipulation, but through recognition. Opportunities appear without striving. Resources arrive without desperation. Solutions present themselves without effort. Why? Because the Christ knows no lack, and when you abide in the Christ, you leave the consciousness of lack entirely. 7. Relationships are transformed when Christ consciousness begins to reveal itself. You cease seeing others as personalities. You see beneath the surface. You sense the divine identity in everyone, even those who oppose you. Judgment dissolves. Resentment dissolves. Grievance dissolves. You no longer try to change people. You no longer try to correct them. You no longer need them to be different. You rest in the realization Christ is the truth of them, whether they know it or not. And this recognition itself begins to heal the atmosphere of every relationship you touch. People around you feel safer. They soften. They respond differently, not because you attempt to change them, but because the presence you carry changes the space in which they stand. 8. An unseen radiance begins to shine through you. You may not notice it at first, but others will. A calmness, a clarity, a quiet depth, a presence that cannot be explained. You do not preach. You do not persuade. You do not try to convert. Your presence itself becomes the message. You become, unconsciously and without effort, a transparency for the light of God. This is the ministry of presence Goldsmith spoke of. It cannot be taught. It cannot be learned. It cannot be practiced. It is the natural radiation of the Christ realized. People feel healed simply by sitting with you. People feel more peaceful after speaking with you. People feel hope in your silence. Not because you are special, but because Christ is present and Christ alone does the work. 9. The personal self gently falls away. This may be the most profound consequence. The sense of me begins to dissolve, not in a frightening way, not in a dramatic way, not in an annihilating way, but gently, like mist evaporating in the morning sun. You stop defending the personal self. You stop glorifying the personal self. You stop fearing for the personal self. You stop relying on the personal self. And in the absence of this false me, the true I, the Christ, shines unobstructed. This is not the death of identity. It is the revelation of your real identity. 10. Life becomes a living unfoldment of God. Eventually, Christ consciousness brings you into a state where you live entirely from the realization that God is the life of me. God is the mind of me. God is the love of me. God is the being of me. God is the infinite, invisible, expressing as me. You cease planning life. Life unfolds. You cease controlling life. Life moves. You cease fearing life. Life reveals. You live spontaneously, in harmony, guided not by thought, but by presence. This is the life Jesus lived. This is the life the mystics discovered. This is the life Goldsmith revealed. And this quietly, simply, gently, is the life that becomes yours when the Christ is realized within you. My friends, this is not imagination. This is not theory. This is not wishful thinking. This is lived experience, the fruit of recognition. Now let us complete our journey with the final section, the gentle closing of this unfolding. My friends, we have walked together through a sacred path, not a path of belief, not a path of doctrine, but a path of inner recognition. And now, as we come to this concluding moment, let us not think of this as an ending, for truth has no ending, presence has no boundary, awakening has no final chapter. This is not the close of a teaching. This is the beginning of a life lived from a deeper center, a quieter foundation, a truer identity. Let us rest together for a moment in silence, for in silence the Christ speaks.